Welcome to the first podcast of the We Trade series on Africa. We're going to be talking to Tom Courtright, who is covering a very interesting and fast-growing space around e-mobility. Tom, welcome to the inaugural podcast. Thank you very much for being our guinea pig.
Thank you, Ben. My pleasure.
Just before we jump into your passion, it'd probably be a good idea to just understand your background, how you got here, what brought you to East Africa in the first place?
So, it started about 30 years ago in Malawi, but so I grew up mostly in Tanzania, and I've been living in Uganda and Kenya for the last 5 or 6 years now. So when I was living in Uganda, I was taking bodabodas, motorcycle taxis every day. I made a good friend who was starting up Zembo, an electric motorcycle company there back in 2018. And this was one of the very first e-mobility companies in East Africa. And at that time, of course, he was just bringing in 6 or 7 different models of Chinese electric motorcycles, testing them on the road, seeing where it all went. So that was kind of my entry point to the sector. Got very interested in all of this, did my master's, now I'm working on my PhD on the topic. And I'm also the research director now at the Africa E-Mobility Alliance. So my interest here is because motorcycles run large parts of Africa, right? There's something of a boda belt that runs between Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Dakar, Senegal, the outskirts of Dakar at least.
I recall you were saying yesterday in a panel discussion there's something like 27 million of them.
Yeah, that's our estimate. So it's very difficult to get good numbers on this because governments register motorcycles, but they don't deregister them.
Okay.
So that's been our estimate from looking at all 54 countries across Africa is around 27 million. Now that does include scooters, it includes some tuk-tuks, but it's a very large market and it's one we should take seriously.
Okay. So what is the fascination with tuk-tuks and scooters as a mode of transport for this region? Why is it so pervasive?
So with tuk-tuks and scooters, we have very different use cases. So what's really fascinating to me about tuk-tuks as a transportation person is that they operate both in terms of door-to-door services, so like your Uber, your taxi, etc., but they also run arterial services. Now, I don't know how much you want to talk about the transportation aspect of things, which I do find quite fascinating, but they are this hybrid mode, and that means that when we're thinking about do they need to be charged, do they need to be using battery swapping, and so on, this is something we need to be keeping in mind. They're competing with minibuses, matatus, dala-dalas, whatever term you want to use. They're also competing with motorcycle taxis. They're also competing with, walking and so on. When we think about scooters are fascinating to me because they're really a personal use thing. And you find them widely across Francophone Africa. So you'll find them Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, Senegal. But they're not really there in Nigeria or in Ghana, or you don't really find them in East Africa much, outside of Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. So they play a very interesting kind of niche role there. Motorcycle taxis are what really are fascinating to me because they've filled this gap, right? So post-independence, you had several bus services that had started during the colonial era, which were really built to serve, the elite. They weren't built to serve the masses, and so they didn't last. They didn't survive. And so you have matatus rise up in Kenya, similar services across the continent. And motorcycle taxis started in Nigeria in the 80s. They started in Busia as bicycle taxis, actually, in 1976. I was recently there on the border, speaking with some of the very first boda riders.
It sounds like something I need to do more of.
You should, yeah, go out there. You start with coffee smuggling, actually. That's how you get into it. So, awesome. Yeah, so anyway, so it was a handful of coffee smugglers who looked for a more legitimate means of earning an income, and they went into carrying passengers. Okay. And then eventually they turned into motorcycles in the 90s and so on, and now you find them just about everywhere across the region.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, I was a colleague of mine who had spent some time in Southeast Asia showed me a photograph of, I think it was Ho Chi Minh City in about 1990. And then he had taken a photograph 30 years later. The 1990 photograph was everybody running around with bicycles. Everybody was cycling. And then 30 years later, everybody was on scooters.
Yep.
It's just an incredible transformation that's been going on across emerging markets, and I suppose Africa's not an exception. It's the rule. It's basically how you get around.
Yeah. Absolutely. So in Burkina Faso, they even call them poulet bicyclette. So, chicken bicycles. So you had massive numbers of two-wheelers. They were all bicycles. Now they're all scooters. Okay. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting thing, and it's popped up in different markets a little differently everywhere. But everyone just wants cheap transportation, and that's something that unites all of us, and that's why we see this everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, even on an expensive transport e-hailing platform like Uber, yeah, you can now get your boda. You can get it in electric form. You can get an ICE. Costs you $1 to get from here back to the hotel. It's a really convenient way of getting around. And given the traffic is so hectic, yeah, it's probably faster than using the traditional sort of cars and everything like that.
It's completely taken over some cities. So in Kampala, there hasn't been a lot of very updated data. I was part of a survey 2 years back where previous to that, the statistics said that about 10% of trips in Kampala were by boda. 2021, 30%, fully a third.
Really?
As many trips on boda as minibuses. Now that's trips, right? That's not vehicles. So that means that there's something like 10 motorcycles for every minibus in Kampala. They absolutely run the city of Kampala.
It was one of my favorite things. I was doing some research in Kampala in 2006, talking about something called cell phone banking, which we estimated 1 million people might take up. I think we got those estimates completely wrong.
I think so.
by a factor of 10. Yeah, and the funnest part of my stay there and doing all the research was racing between meetings on the back of a boda, being told to keep my knees in because you might hit the cars that were screaming past. I mean, has it got even worse than that? I mean, is it completely dominated now by bodas?
Yeah, no, they completely run the city. I mean, one of the things that happened during COVID was that, they were trying to reduce exposure for people. And so that meant requiring that minibuses operated at half capacity. Well, this is a private sector thing, really. So in order for these minibus operators to survive, that meant that they had to double the prices of all the seats. You double the price of all the seats, and all of a sudden it's way more competitive. So bodas had a huge boost from that, even though they suffered a really, really drastic 4-month lockdown in which they couldn't take any passengers. Still, they came out of that highly competitive with minibuses, and minibuses have just been continuing to struggle as a result.
Sure. So, moving on to the next evolution in that stage. I mean, the other thing I remember about Uganda was just the amount of smoke and exhaust fumes that one had to survive as you raced through the traffic. That's, I presume, still an issue. What does an e-boda do to that? I mean, how are you seeing those changes coming through?
Yeah, good question. So I would actually point out that in 2006 it would have been much worse even, because at that time, so they started off being used 2-stroke vehicles coming in from Japan. So those 2-stroke vehicles were particularly bad in terms of fumes. So when we moved to 4-stroke, there was a bit of an improvement that has been kind of compensated for in terms of sheer numbers. Right. Okay. Obviously, what happens with electric motorcycles is you no longer have tailpipe emissions. As you move along, nothing is coming out of the back of the boda. Wonderful. Now, of course, that energy usage is being shifted elsewhere. So that part looks different in every country. So in a place like Uganda is 90% renewable, and that's almost all hydro. So in Uganda, it means great things in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. It means great things in terms of local air pollution, right? Here in Kenya, it's around 70-80% clean energy. Now, in West Africa, unfortunately, you have a lot more reliance on fossil fuel. So that means that, Spiro, for example, which is right now the largest electric motorcycle operator in Africa with over 10,000 bikes and scooters on the road, they've operated mostly in Togo and Benin. And so, yes, they're removing air pollution from the road, wonderful, right? Better health outcomes, and so on. But those emissions are being shifted towards, in some cases, offshore diesel generators, in other cases, thermal power plants farther from the city. So there is still a reduction in emissions because of the efficiency of these, of electric motors. However, there's still more emissions taking place as a result of that. So it's a varied picture is what I'm getting at, but in terms of on the street everywhere, it's a massive improvement.
Okay. And the other thing that most people don't really realize is that noise pollution is almost as stressful as air pollution. What's happening to Kampala? Is it getting quieter? I can't imagine it getting quieter. Am I going to be able to hear a marabou stalk the next time I go?
Yeah, you'll hear them coming down for you. So, I mean, yes, of course, there's almost no noise. However, this does also depend. We were talking a little bit earlier about motor types, right? So there's two types of motors. There's hub motors, which are directly on the wheel, spinning the wheel. And then there's mid-drive motors, which run a chain. So for the hub motors, they're very, very quiet. You do still hear the vehicle moving on the street, the tire tread and so on, but almost silent in comparison. For the mid-drive motors, though, which are running a chain, there is a sound from the chain.
Okay.
So that can be louder or quieter, but in general, it's not actually silent, but it is certainly a lot less loud than the engines. Actually, this issue has been brought up by a few people who are concerned that, well, if it's quiet, how will I hear the vehicle coming, right? But I've used these quite a few times, and you just hit the horn. It's pretty straightforward, So overall, it's a drastic improvement, definitely, in terms of sound and noise pollution on the street, but it will take some time before these fully take over.
Okay, so what is the average lifetime or lifespan of a boater, an ICE versus an electric, and how fast does that shift? I mean, we've been trying to calculate what the impact on fuel consumption is going to be as a result of US, for example, shifting to hybrid and EV. Europe's now moved 50% is non-ICE sales now in the latest months of sales. But obviously that's on an average year or lifespan of a car of sort of 12 years in the US. So it's going to take a while for consumption to drop. I presume that motor vehicles don't last as long as they do in the US, or am I wrong?
So every vehicle segment is very different. So when you look at the motorcycle segment, it really depends on the use, right? So when we look at bodas and motorcycle taxis, they don't last very long because they're used very intensively, right? On average, guys are doing 100 to 120 kilometers a day. They're used quite intensively. Some people are better with maintenance, some less so. So on average, I normally use the estimate of about a 5-year lifespan for a motorcycle taxi.
Oh, wow.
Pretty short. So what ends up happening a lot of the time, you have a lot of these asset financiers, these motorcycle financiers that have been coming in, right? Started with Tugende, now you have Watu, Mogo, etc. And basically, they normally have leases of between 1.5 to 2 years. And so during that time, the guy's paying off the motorcycle, and then at the end of it, he owns it. And a few different things can happen here, sort of 3 things. One is he just keeps using it, and he makes a lot more profit every day as a result, right? Because he's no longer paying for the motorcycle. The second one is that he starts renting it out and buys himself another motorcycle. So he has another source of income.
That sounds very familiar.
Yes, yeah. It's a good way to make money,
Yeah.
It's a life vest in a difficult economy. And then the third one is that he sells it on immediately. And this is why I'm bringing this up in terms of lifespan, is because when used motorcycles are sold, there's this really interesting geographic effect where a lot of those asset financiers are in capital cities or at the center of towns. When he resells them, he'll resell them to somebody on the periphery, or he'll sell them out into the village. So when you get out into the villages, you get much older vehicles, much older motorcycles. And so you just have this kind of gradual, this lifespan where, they go out to the cemetery in the village eventually until they just use until they break down. In terms of cars and the like, obviously there's a huge, second life market here, right? A lot of used cars coming in. So a lot of the time they're brought in already 5 to 10 years old. We're talking about passenger cars here, and then they're used for about another 10 years at least. On the bus front, it's complex because you will have chassis that are being built locally, manufactured locally, and then they'll put those on, like the body and the engine and whatnot, of an imported used vehicle. So Kenya has a kind of unique situation there, and those can last 15 years or so. So that's the other reason to be optimistic specifically about motorcycles transitioning to electric, is there's no need to take ICE vehicles off the road, because in 5 years it will already be off the road. Yeah. So if we just hit sales, there's no need for additional measures,
So what's the constraint? I mean, it sounds like Africa's going to be ahead of the curve on the energy transition without doing anything.
Yeah, well, so the constraint, as always, is capital. So essentially, or so often, is capital. So obviously, first of all, you need to be at cost parity. And they've just recently got there. And the way to get to cost parity, on the motorcycle front at least, is you separate the cost of the battery and the vehicle. Because the battery will cost is around 40% of the cost of the vehicle. And in general, and I'll try not to get too technical here, but if you're looking at around 5 kilowatt hours of energy being used every day by a motorcycle taxi, which is a pretty solid average, a battery of that size would be quite expensive. And not everybody has electricity access at home. Electricity access isn't always consistent. But the main thing is that would just add a massive cost to the vehicle. So an ICE motorcycle here can be anything. In Kenya, you can get them for around $1,000. In Uganda, they're around $1,200. So in order to compete with that, again, you take apart the battery in the vehicle. So you can bring in a reasonable electric motorcycle for just over that price, for around $1,200, $1,400 USD. But the battery is then kept separate and you do battery swapping. So this is what is difficult, is the capex of the battery swapping is really high. I mean, those batteries they're not cheap, right? So you're looking at something like at least $1,500 to $2,000 per motorcycle in battery. And that has to be paid off slowly over time through each swap. So setting up all those swap stations, getting the capital to do that has been the main constraint.
Okay. And just in terms of the type of battery, the life on those batteries is comparable to what you would expect in a normal EV in Europe, or are the chemistries different? What are the battery types that are currently popular in this part of the world? Yeah,
it's a good question. So for the motorcycles, the main lithium-ion chemistries, of course, are NMC and LFP. So the key differences here for listeners is that NMC batteries are higher density, meaning that you can get more energy out of a smaller, lighter battery. LFP batteries are lower density, so they're bigger, bulkier. But LFP batteries are much safer. So LFP batteries can get to a much higher temperature without ever setting on fire. And as a result, a lot of companies have either started with LFP here or are moving to LFP because a couple of videos of batteries on fire going around on drivers' WhatsApp groups is going to be a terrible thing.
Yes.
That will spread a terrible message. And so when you're thinking about that, then that has all these kinds of implications in terms of the battery swap system, right? Because a lot of people want to do LFP, but if you have a really heavy battery, it makes it harder to pull it out physically yourself. I mean, these things are 20, 30 kg. If you have a cabinet and you have to lift it and put it up high, right? This also has been an issue in some cases where if you're trying to bring more women on board, it can be daunting, right? Dealing with some of these. Some of them can be downright dangerous. People have crushed toes with these things. So all of that is kind of going into the debate right now. And the other, in terms of lifespan, right, this is such a critical question for making the battery swapping model work. Because when the cost of a battery swap is, of course, the cost of electricity, it's maybe the cost of either a little cabinet if you just have that, or it's the cost of rent of the shop, which are small, generally speaking. But the real cost there is going to be amortizing, paying off the debt of the battery. So how much debt you have to pay off depends on how long you think the battery is going to last.
Yep.
And how long the battery lasts, is it going to be 1,000 life cycles? Can you recharge it 1,000 times fully? Or can you recharge it 3,000 times fully? Obviously, massive impact, 1 to 3,000 in terms of what the cost is. And that is determined primarily by the C rate. So sorry for the too many technical terms, but what matters here is the C rate is the charging rate. So if you're charging a battery very fast or discharging a battery very fast, that is going to reduce its lifespan. So in order for that to work better, you either need to have larger batteries so that the relative discharge is low, or you need to be really, really clever in your swapping systems and your charging systems so that these batteries are being charged slowly so that they will last for longer. So that is where that's really kind of the key balance everyone's trying to work out between the size of the battery, the C rate, and what is the stock of these batteries that you're going to have.
And what's the current cycle record that you've heard of for a fleet of batteries in the market?
I mean, it's so early days that most people haven't got there.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So most people just haven't gotten to that level, right? And so most people can kind of theorize. They can say, okay, well, our depth of discharge, the reduced capacity of the battery is now at 95% instead of 100%. So we think we'll get to this. So it's really unclear. In general, I haven't seen anything super impressive. I haven't seen anybody thinking that they're going to get to 2,500 life cycles. Most people right now are assuming they'll only be able to do around 1,500.
Okay. And the economics work at the lower 1,500 cycles. So if they manage to get it on the upside, then obviously it's a killer application with a much lower cost to serve.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I picked up when you were talking through the relative prices of Kenya versus Uganda on the importation is that there's a 20% difference in the pricing. I mean, what is that down to? Because they're both part of the East African community, so surely it should be tariff-free between those two places. You're telling me that it's the cost of moving a motorcycle is 20% of its value between the main market, Nairobi and Kampala? Is that...
There's a lot that goes into it. I mean, there is obviously additional transportation costs. What it really looks like when it shows up on the border and how long it stays at customs.
What is the current time at that border post at the moment?
So at the border post itself is not necessarily long, but then it gets to Kampala and then it sits in customs. And it can sit in customs for more than a month. That's pretty typical in Kampala. And what's happening is part of this is the reality is it kind of comes down to relationships between the company and customs. And who do you know at customs, and what kind of relations do you already have ongoing there to make that easier? Because otherwise things can show up, and there's still not that many electric motorcycles, so people might not be familiar with them. They might not know which HS code they should be under. They might, for example, one of the issues too is around lithium-ion batteries, right? So like I mentioned, they're very expensive part of this. And so getting import duty exemption on that is very important. In both Kenya and Uganda, you can get import duty exemption on solar batteries. Well, what is a solar battery?
Oh, wow.
So what's happened in many cases is that companies have then said, okay, great, we need this, because in Uganda it was 25% import duty without that. In Kenya, not entirely sure why, but they actually requested it to be even higher, so it's 35% if you don't have that solar battery exemption. So to get that, you have to prove that you're a solar company. What is a solar company? So what some companies have done is that they've just installed solar on 2 or 3 of their swap stations when they have maybe 20 swap stations, and they say, we're a solar company, and they've been able to bring them in under that. Others have tried the same with less success. So it boils down to a lot of negotiations, understanding the system, understanding how you can get those kinds of exemptions.
It seems like a ridiculous distinction that should probably fall away. I mean, ultimately, obviously Uganda doesn't have a energy storage problem because most of their energy is hydro, so the base load is sorted. And to a certain extent, I suppose Kenya is the same. But given that transportation is such a significant portion of your carbon emissions, it makes complete sense to do away with that. And there's no local battery industry that you're protecting at the moment. Yeah. So it's just a legacy from another time, probably.
Yeah, I mean, so part of it too is trying to define what level of assembly things come in at. So there are a couple of companies in Uganda that are assembling batteries. Now what matters here is that means that they're bringing in lithium-ion cells, and then they're adding the BMS and the wiring and so on, and the casing, and then you have a battery.
And that comes in duty-free?
Yes, if they're able to prove that they're solar, and those companies have. But it doesn't normally come in duty-free. The cells are not coming in duty-free. But then, so anyway, so that's one component of it. You've also got, the Kenyan government has recently actually dropped VAT on lithium-ion batteries under the Finance Act. So they dropped VAT of 18%. Great, but import duty is still there.
Okay. And basing yourself in Kenya, so importing the product into Kenya, paying the duty in Kenya, and then shipping it across, is that not a more efficient way of dealing with the customs issue in Uganda? Because as you cross the border, it's EAC, you don't have the issue.
So they would still check up on which taxes have been paid, so there's a lot of complications there. There's really nobody working in Kenya and Uganda. I mean, because people are still mostly pilot scale, they have stick to one country. Okay. Only a couple of companies have done multiple. Ampersand is in both Rwanda and Kenya, but they've actually, because Rwanda has really good incentives, and Rwanda has dropped all import, excise, and VAT on all electric vehicle segments and lithium-ion batteries.
Wow.
So yeah, they did this about a year and a half ago, and then everybody else in East Africa was like, oh, we've got to catch up.
Yes.
So Ampersand has based themselves there, despite it being a relatively small market, and they've done pretty well. They've got more than 1,200 bikes on the road now, and then they came into Kenya. Okay. But most folks say we need to just deal with this market first.
Okay. And then going back to this issue around accessing capital, I mean, early stage, it's equity, convertible debt, type structures in place. I mean, I noticed that there was one Swedish-based VC who's playing in this space, but I mean, who's funding all of this? Who's getting this all off the ground?
Yeah, good question. So it's also changed a bit quite a bit over the years. There's been a little bit of a funding winter right now, globally, of course. But what you had, at least from 5 years ago or so, is you had a lot of the folks who, like Persistent Energy Capital or Kawisafi, although they haven't quite got into it yet, but they're planning to. But Persistent, for example, is an early player. So they have supported Tree, they supported EcoBoda, they supported Asobo. So this is three-wheelers, two-wheelers, boats. So they were small-scale equity, right? So they came in and they said, what we need is equity in the scale of like $100,000 to $500,000, and that is what people needed. Obviously, they needed multiple of those, and that's what it was initially. There was been a handful of grants. There's things like Energy Catalyst, there's EEP, and they've all been providing some combination of grant and equity. Now, of course, the issue now is we need to move into debt, and there's not a lot of people who are ready for that because most of the debt players want to do minimum 10 million, right? So Ampersand got debt of around 10 million from USAID, DIV, and that's great, but most folks have kind of struggled to get across that chasm. And part of the reason is, like I kind of hinted at with the battery swap system, you're actually building an ecosystem. You're building a whole ecosystem. They're not doing one thing. They're not just trying to sell bikes. They're trying to adapt a bike to the local context, right? They need to make sure the bike can deal with these roads, can deal with these rain, can deal with intensive usage. They're also trying to ensure that there are battery swap stations everywhere, and they're financing all those batteries. They're also doing all the maintenance. You know, they're also, in many cases, at least initially, less so now, thanks be to God, is that they've been doing a lot of the financing for their own bikes. So running so many things at once, a lot of them have really struggled to make that leap, and the funding winter is not helping. But there's a few that have jumped across. So Spiro has raised over 130 million. They're frankly in a league of their own, but they also are quite unique because they are backed sort of by you could call them like a special economic zone or industrial zone provider. And so they have a completely different situation from everyone else.
Sorry, and they also, I mean, if I remember correctly, you were saying that Spiro is based in Francophone West Africa?
Yeah, so they started in Togo and Benin, but they've come to Kenya very recently.
Okay. So they benefited from the fact that there was an easily convertible currency at a fixed rate with the euro. So from a financing perspective, it was less risky for investors to put bigger numbers behind
that also
plans.
helped, but they also had their own financing. They put about 60, 70 million of their own money in, which nobody else has been able to do. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And so, I mean, everything comes back to dollars. I mean, it's a weird conversation in an environment where local banks sit with not enough lending on their books and are clearly afraid of providing anything longer than 6 to 12 month financing or providing salary lending to folks who work for government. I mean, it's just the most bizarre environment that we sit in, that we're now having to source US dollar financing at nominally higher rates when you convert it back and have to deal with the exchange rate risks to what you could potentially get from an innovative commercial bank with who has available capital to do this type of thing. I mean, what's your experience from the ground of the pain and suffering that funders have gone through dealing with local banks and local finances around that?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, most really haven't got into debt yet. But to be honest, local banks were not something most people even think about in terms of the motorcycle space. Now, where they do matter, because they local banks very rarely have managed successful financing programs for ICE bikes. It's just not something they want to do because it's a small asset, there's a lot of risk, you have to have a big field team, all these sorts of things.
But now you've got a battery charging business that is separate from a vehicle financing business with potentially different cash flow behaviors as well as less risks around that. It seems to me obvious that as a bank, it's much easier to finance a lithium battery, especially if it's a standard specification battery that can be appropriately collateralized or repossessed and sold at a market reference rate. It seems like, I wouldn't necessarily touch the frame of a boulder, but I would touch that battery.
I think in general there's just kind of a lot of risk avoidance. They don't fully understand the sector yet, which is fair. I mean, I think the business models, a number are still being tested. And like I said, we don't even have good numbers yet on the lifespan of these batteries. That's obviously something that's going to be very important for these banks. They want to understand everything behind that. They want to know, can somebody hack this battery, and so on and so forth. So, they see no reason to jump into it now. There are a handful of folks like Untapped who are looking at trying to finance battery assets, but there's not many. And there's not many with the kind of concessional rates that are really needed.
Okay.
But like I said, in the bus sector, it looks very different.
Yeah, so just unpack that for me, because that seems to be a much more attractive asset to deal with. First of all, you've got less of them.
Yeah.
Hopefully driving a little bit more safely.
Yeah, a little bit easier to track.
A little bit easier to track.
Yeah. You can spot them from a little bit farther away.
That's excellent.
But yeah, so in Kenya, you've long had banks financing matatus, buses here. So they'll finance these buses to something to the tune of $40,000, $50,000.
What's their value? What's their total value?
Total value.
If they're financing 50,000, what is the loan to value of the bus? Are they offering 100% loans on that matatu? Or
so it's normally something between 70 to 90%. 70% is pretty standard.
Okay.
If there's a lot of trust built up, you might get higher, 80%, et cetera. But typically 70%. So basically what's happened now with EV buses, and what you have at least being pioneered by Bosigo, and I'm sure many others will soon follow, is that you split the battery cost from the cost of the bus, so that the bus still costs around $50,000, and the banks are very happy with that. They also look very innovative and cutting edge, and they're doing a great thing, which they are. And then the battery gets paid off over time through Bosigo taking care of that bus in total. So they'll set up the charging networks, they'll set up the maintenance, and then they will charge the operators on a per kilometer or otherwise basis. And that way they can make their money back on the battery.
Okay. I mean, that sounds very familiar to the ICE matatu business called Transaction Capital in South Africa that developed a very, very good model around maintaining. I mean, those matatus probably do the same sort of distances. I think the record for Transaction Capital was a bus that had done over 1 million kilometers, and they knew at 451,000 kilometers they were going to have to replace the rear axle, and the gearbox went at 651 because they knew it was they only financed one OEM, Toyota. They knew exactly when those parts were going to fall apart, so it became a very, very efficient, well-managed solution. I mean, do you see that happening here? Is there that type of control that's going on around the industry? Was it still early days, I presume?
Yeah, it's still pretty early days, and I think, right now, obviously, the EV bus players are going to be much more hands-on than ICE bus players. Way, way, way more hands-on. I mean, they're literally checking these buses every night. So they are going to have really good data around this. But what that ends up looking like. But didn't Transaction Capital run into some issues recently?
Yeah, they happened to buy a second-hand vehicle financing business, which coincided with you highlighted the problem with COVID and matatus. We had exactly the same issue in South Africa. So the taxi industry is under very significant strain at the moment. There's been a lot of surprisingly exits. I mean, it's a huge thing, and I think the other thing that has happened is that the way that South Africans are working is different to what they did pre-COVID. So there's now less trips, all that type of thing going on. So there's been, the taxi industry in South Africa is a slightly different beast in that it's quite organized, and there are associations that sort of self-regulate that. I don't know whether that happens in East Africa, whether that's a common structure for doing those sort of bus transport networks.
Yeah, every country is different. So Kenya has SACCOs. So under the Michuki rules, which were brought in around 2004, every matatu has to be part of a SACCO. The SACCOs then get routes, and then the matatus can run on specific routes. So there is a degree of control there, at least certainly more than there was before.
And funding. I mean, a SACCO sits on reasonable deposit funding. I mean, there's some specific regulations around lending from a SACCO perspective, but it's not impossible to think that a SACCO is a good place to start in terms of finding and mobilizing local capital. Yeah,
no, it makes sense. I think it's a smart way to go about it, right? It uses an existing operational group, an existing type of entity to organize these guys. I think it makes a lot of sense. Here, they might have been slightly stronger, right? So that hasn't been attempted really seriously in Uganda or in Tanzania. Tanzania still has a lot of control over fares. so it looks different in that sense. Uganda was one of the only countries to have a complete monopoly, a minibus organization that had a complete monopoly, UTODA, but they fell apart around 2011, 2012. They were cracked down on because they were kind of abusing their power, right? They controlled the taxis, they're called there, the taxi ranks, minibus ranks, and they were extorting a lot of people, and so the government kind of brought them back under control, but broke up UTODA. And so there's been kind of a lot of fragmentation and some level of chaos as a result of that.
Yeah, which will stabilize, and I suppose the industry will move forward, because ultimately there is a need, it has to be served, and ultimately everybody needs to get around and...
Yeah, well, I appreciate your optimism. You know, I mean, the reality is that transportation is something that is very politically linked. There's a lot of politics in it, so I don't need to get into details there, but it does make some of that a little bit more difficult.
Well, it's logical for it to be political because everybody uses it. I suppose everybody has an opinion on what they should be doing, whether it's too expensive or too cheap, or...
And it will always earn money. People always need to use buses or bodabodas or anything.
Yeah.
And it's highly visible, and it's a key part of the economy. So, yeah, it does.
I mean, which goes to the next point. We've got African free trade area that's now kicked in. We've got the consolidation of countries in there that are motor manufacturers. I think you alluded to SKD type and the separation between battery and vehicle. I mean, what initiatives are underway to self-provision that, and what are the constraints around that space?
Yeah, you know, it's complex. So here in Kenya, there's a national automotive policy that was brought about last year, but it doesn't have teeth yet. So we need to have a National Automotive Act, with that an automotive council, right, to kind of guide this, have content policies. For the most part, it's just super dependent on the segment. So, for example, in the motorcycle segment, what they do is they provide some import duty relief. It goes from 25% to 10% if you're bringing it in CKD, and what this means completely knocked down is that there are some parts that are not being brought in with that. And so that means those parts have to be sourced locally, right? Great move. Right now, it's a little bit of an issue in the electric motorcycle segment because everyone is testing out a lot of different models that are not necessarily compatible with what's being built locally, because there's some manufacturing locally of spare parts and so on, but it's not super complex yet, it's not super flexible. And so people are having to bring in CKD motorcycles, removing those parts, and then they ship in those parts separately and pay full import duty on them. So obviously in the long run, what we really need to have is we need to have a lot better conversations between the OEMs who are building these motorcycles in China and in India and the local spare parts manufacturers. We assume that, you know, there will be a little bit of the space will settle, and we probably won't have 20 major models. Like, we'll probably end up just like with Bajaj, TVS, and Haojue, we'll end up with a handful, and that will make it easier for the local manufacturers. But there needs to be more of an effort there, and hopefully that's something that the Automotive Council and Automotive Act, when it comes about, should help take care of, is to bring those two parts together in order to have more local value addition. I
know there's some complexity around the treatment of special economic zones in the East African community, and there's some issues with regards to how an SEZ in East Africa will probably not benefit from being able to re-export to other East African community members, which is the deal under, I understand, the African Free Trade Agreement, is that SEZs, onshore SEZs, will be treated as onshore from a duties perspective. But do you see SEZs as providing that bridging point potentially between foreign manufacturers who want to procure the necessary local content in order to qualify their product for local or completely knock down import duty status and the other options available? If we can see them, if they can play that role, that will be wonderful. I think sometimes SEZs, I think some folks have built up SEZs to be more helpful in larger scale than they have been so far, but I think that there's the potential there, and we would like that to happen. You know, East Africa, there's a long history between Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya around cooperation.
if I may call out, right now, President Ruto has been complaining that there's a food shortage in Kenya. Well, at the same time, he's been blockading Ugandan food. He has been blockading Ugandan dairy and other food goods. So there isn't actually a shortage. There's some politicking there that's been going on. This has been going on for a number of years now, actually. It's not new to him. So there needs to be strengthening. I mean, AFCFTA can help with that. EAC, right now in Tanzania, we have somebody who's engaging a lot more, right? Mama Samia Suluhu Hassan. And that is great, right? We can have a more engaged kind of EAC there. But that's really, really important to work out all of those kinks. As always, I think that there's a lot of local solutions that are just kind of waiting to be engaged with. Uganda is a breadbasket. Kenya is a manufacturing power. There's a lot of ways in which these countries could be working together a little bit closer, and which sometimes historic ties complicate.
Okay. So where do you see transportation in East Africa in 10 years? I mean, what is your optimistic view of this market, and maybe a view on your pessimistic view?
Flying bodas.
Flying bodas.
No, so
yeah.
Would you get on one?
Yeah, it would be awesome. Don't have to pay tolls, don't have to sit in traffic.
Yeah. So I think 10 years from now, the major shifts are going to be, I really do think 10 years from now, the majority of bodas, at least in terms of sales, absolutely, the majority will already be electric. Because the cost parity thing is there. Drivers know they can save money on maintenance, fuel, et cetera, et cetera. They see that as a great thing. It will happen rapidly, right? The other big question right now is, we were talking a little bit earlier about trains, right? And in railways. And right now in Tanzania, you're seeing a big reinvestment in railways. So Dar to Kigoma, a very historic, classic railway, right, built over 100 years ago, back when Lake Tanganyika was a major power, and it was almost like a Swahili outpost out there. If you go out there, it's really incredible, because you're more than 1,500 kilometers from the coast, and you get to this small town, and it's like you're on the Swahili coast. There's dhows in Lake Tanganyika. It's fascinating. So they're trying to, reinvigorate that. Kigoma is close to Bujumbura. It's across the border. You can see DRC across the lake, right? So if those railway systems, additionally, they're trying to complete the one that was started in Mombasa and made it to Nairobi and was supposed to get to Kampala. Hasn't yet, but there's been a recent attempt to reinvigorate that and bring that to life. Wonderful if we can make that happen, right? We can shift some trucks off the road, but we can also make passenger transport a lot easier. So I'm optimistic. I choose to be very optimistic about railways. I'm a big fan of railways. If we can also bring Tazara back to life. So that was the old Tanzania-Zambia railway built by the Chinese in the 70s with their hands. It was an incredibly impressive feat. Beautiful views too, if you ever get the chance. So I'm optimistic that a increase in railways and that potentially new political settlements around bodabodas will allow us to improve the services in the sector, right? Reduce some of the road safety issues, have registrations which work and which people engage with. The big questions, which can lead to dystopia or utopia, apps. How well are apps going to work? So here in Nairobi, they've worked pretty well. They've taken over quite a bit, obviously, especially where we are here, right, in higher income areas around Westlands, less so in other areas, but they've worked fairly well. In Uganda, not so much, right? So about 30% of bodas in Uganda have gotten on apps. Half of them have left, more than half of them. So it's not quite there in certain respects, but they do have some promise. And if there's a little bit more of a push, especially from the top, especially from government, around things like passenger helmet wearing, I'm very optimistic about that. I think people will adopt it. We saw that with SafeBoda. There was adoption of passenger helmets, right? Which otherwise you'd think this is such an obvious thing that can reduce fatalities on the road. So if we can get back to some of those basics and really push some of that, then wonderful. The other question there is BRTs, right? So bus rapid transit, right? So that's where you have a bus in its own exclusive lane, and it acts like light rail or acts like any other mass transit system at way lower cost than anything. So Dar built their BRT called Mwendo Kasi, right, meaning going very fast. So they built their BRT around 5 or 6 years ago. It's incredible. It is so loved that it's kind of overly packed. So if you get on it at the beginning of the line, by the second stop, it is completely full.
Okay.
So these systems will have a lot of demand. In a city like Dar, which is massive, right, it gets a huge amount of demand. Nairobi, there's been a recent push for it again, especially to have electric BRT. So just for comparison across the continent, Dakar has just built the first fully electric BRT line. There's right now funding from the EU to make the BRT here electric. I'm optimistic it can 100% happen. It does require some political willpower. You have to take a lane, right? It does not work if you don't take a lane. If you say they have to compete with traffic, it's just the same as any other matatu.
Yep.
But I think it's doable here.
And how is that being financed? Because, I mean, we did BRT in Joburg, and it was financed out of the municipality, and then things started going sideways. And in contrast, we had a rail concession. There was a rail concession in South Africa called Bombela, which linked the airports and the key business districts together, and it was incredibly successful. In fact, I think they hit their targets years in advance. So agree violently that this works, but the trick has always been around who's responsible for funding this thing, because it's a chunk of change, and then who runs it, because you've got to finance that thing over 15, 20 years or whatever it is, and if stuff's breaking down faster, then obviously it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, it's complex, and I understand that part of the reason that South Africa was able to pull it off is because it was in the run-up to the World Cup. So they said, great, we need this. There was a lot of political willpower behind it as a result, right, which hasn't existed in East Africa, which is why there's been plans for BRT in both.
We want you to have a World Cup, and then you can have the excuse
Well, we're going
to
to have AFCON in 2027. I'm super excited. It was just announced today. There's going to be Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda together. So, come back in 2027. Yeah, we'll be enjoying. We'll be eating life here with that. So, BRT local financing, I mean, maybe I should go back and get my MBA to give you a better answer, but I think that, there is debt financing from folks like World Bank, some concessional financing, which can be very supportive and which can get folks there. I mean, in the long run, even the one in Dar is only 5-6 years old, so, whether we hit the milestones and the debt payments in time is something we have yet to see.
Okay. This has been a fascinating journey around transportation in East Africa and the social implications of the various technologies as they're being deployed, as well as what's going on in financial services to try or avoid financing all of these ideas. I wish you all the best of luck, and hopefully this is the first of a number of conversations on this topic, because it's seriously, not only is it very interesting, but I think it's hugely impactful in terms of moving this part of the world forward. And as you say, it's a border belt that runs from this side on East Africa all the way through to West Africa. There's hardly a country and city not impacted by it. So thank you very much for your time, and hope to chat to you soon again.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, keep an eye out. Folks like African Mobility Alliance are doing a lot to kind of bring this forward. So, thanks to Trends and WeTrade, and we're excited to see where it all goes.
Yeah, hope so too. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Ben.
Cheers.